about a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Well, there really was a world.
Welcome to Creation Foundations, where we discuss things from a biblical worldview. I'm Dick Temple.
I'm Mark Finkbeiner.
And I'm Greg Morgan.
Well, it's been a little while since the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, but there's a lot of things that came up in that are worth discussing. And various people have various impressions of, well, who won the debate? And I've got my opinion. You know, a debate really isn't won on the science or the evidence. A debate is won or lost on the audience perception. Well, my perception may be a little different than some others, but I make my living in science, so I'm not interested in the fluff and feathers. Ken Ham gave us a talk which was very conservative, very much to the point, and as far as science is concerned, he pretty well won the debate. Now, he had a major problem in dealing with this debate because he was talking to the American public. He's talking to us. You see, when American science students are compared with science students around the world, they always end up on the bottom of the heap. You know, so he had to teach basic science for his audience to understand the debate. So he started out by explaining the difference between historical science and observational science. You see, American students are taught to memorize, not to think. I spent 21 years in the public education system. Only my last 2 years in veterinary school did I have any education on how to think. So that we're going to discuss the difference between observational science and historical science, which Ken Ham made as one of his points. And observations are much different from beliefs. Observational science uses observations made in the present, which can be tested and or repeated in the present. Historical science is beliefs about what happened in the past that cannot be observed in the present. Now, where the confusion comes about in this is that observational science may be used to help us determine the likelihood of certain events having happened in the past, but we can't repeat those events. So what I want to do is take potassium-argon dating, you know, radioisotope dating, which is what Bill Nye considered to be his strongest argument, and demonstrate the difference between historical science and observational science. And when we're using radioisotope dating such as potassium-argon, what we're trying to do is find out how long it's been since the rock involved had solidified into a hard rock from its molten state. It's not how long the rock has been in existence since its creation, not how long the matter's been there, but how long it's been a solid rock. So let's take first, what can we do with observational science on this? Well, we can accurately measure the amounts of potassium-40 and argon-40 in a small piece of rock. Okay, and we can accurately measure the current rate of decay of potassium-40 to argon-40. This is observational science. We can repeat this over and over again on that tiny piece of rock and get the same result. But from there, we have to go to historical science. We must assume that no potassium-40 or argon-40 leached in or out of the rock since it's solidified. Because if it did, it's going to totally destroy our data. Well, it has been demonstrated by observational science that potassium-40 is water-soluble and argon-40 is a gas. Now, the rates of leaching of both of these under specific conditions has been measured, which makes it a little difficult to determine what those conditions have been on any given rock that you examine. So with historical science, we must assume that we know how much potassium-40 and how much argon-40 were in the rock when it solidified. That's history. We can't go back there and measure it back then. We have to make an assumption. And we can assume that the rate of decay has always been constant. Well, if there's no outside forces acting on the potassium and the argon, then that would change that rate, then we can assume that the rate has always been constant. Okay, we then assume that the age of the rock can be determined by the ratio of potassium 40 to argon 40. Now we have to assume this because, rather than say that we've proven it, because we're basing our evidence on historical science, we're basing it on assumptions which we have no way in the world of proving. So, how can we use observational science to determine the accuracy of historical science in potassium-argon dating? Well, one thing we can do, we can measure the potassium-argon ratio in different parts of the same rock. Well, this has been done. James P. Dawson was Chief of Engineering and Operations for the Lunar and Earth Science Division of the Manned Spacecraft Center, NASA, in Houston. Now, he was working on lunar samples, the rocks that came from the moon, and it included the Genesis rock. And he said they found ages from 10,000 years to several billion years in the same rock. What does that say about the leaching? Now, we can also date the same rock using different radiometric methods and compare the differences. Well, this has been done too, and the results of the various methods very seldom agree. Or we can measure the potassium-argon ratio in volcanic rocks of known ages. Hey, we know Mount Vesuvius blew up about 2,000 years ago. We know Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980. We know the ages of some of the volcanoes in Hawaii. So these rocks have been dated. And the dates come out much older than what they actually are. Now, Ken Ham showed a slide of the potassium-argon dating of rock from Mount St. Helens. The slide wasn't on there very long, but when they dated the whole piece of rock, they found out that Mount St. Helens blew up 350,000 years ago. Well, they weren't too happy with this, so they also dated the various components of the rock: feldspar, amphibole, pyroxene, and the pyroxene came out with an age of 2.8 million years. That's not very accurate. So there are some things we need to consider about potassium-argon dating. First of all, rocks of known age, radioisotope dating doesn't work. Rocks of unknown age, radioisotope dating is assumed to work. This shows the difference between observational science and historical science. So, in observational science, conclusions are reached by repeated observations. However, in historical science, conclusions are reached based on assumptions and ideology. And politics is a driving force controlling modern science teaching. So why are the results of observational science ignored in modern historical science? Well, in political correctness, the religion of evolutionism, and the school textbooks, the assumptions trump the evidence every time. There are 4 doctrines of political correctness. Evolutionism, which gives us no creator and no absolute standard of truth, which means we have no absolute standard of right and wrong. Then the 4th doctrine is tolerance. Tolerance for those who hold the first 3 beliefs, and intolerance for those who don't. Now, I've just covered one area of radiometric dating, potassium-argon. Greg, would you like to give us some more information on other methods of radiometric dating?
Sure. Bill Nye focused on a form of radioactive dating called rubidium-strontium. Rubidium isotope 87 decays into strontium isotope 87. And it has a half-life of about 50 billion years, according to the 1957 chart of the nuclides. Well, that's assumed to be a constant. But in the 1996 version of the chart of the nuclides, it was 48.8 billion years. Now that's a decrease of 2.5% of the half-life in only 39 years. Why do we assume these things are constant? Well, based on just one, you might go ahead and say that's just laboratory differences. But when you look at it carefully, from the 1949 chart of the nuclides until the 96 chart of the nuclides, the half-lives for the uranium decay chain, where uranium decays through several steps and becomes lead, and that is one of the most frequently used ways of determining the age of rocks. That decay chain, the half-lives have increased by an average of 0.76%. That may not seem like much, and it may not be much over that short a period of time, but how much did it change between 1900 and now, or between the first century and now? The answer to those questions is we don't know. No one does. Scientists usually simply assume that those are constant. As soon as radioactivity was discovered, the physicists who were the most powerful in the world at the time declared that they were constants, and we've accepted that ever since. But if you go to the lightest isotopes, uranium is the heaviest element. If you go to the lightest ones, the other side of the periodic table, for those you find that the half-lives have also increased, but there it's by an average of 3.6%. Now, if you assume that in fact those things have varied through time, then there is no way that you can make an accurate projection of how old rocks are based on radioactive dating, quite aside from the other assumptions that we make. Those other assumptions are rather important, though, as Dick just pointed out. He pointed out that argon and potassium-40, they're water soluble. Well, argon is a noble gas, and it can travel through rocks quite easily because it doesn't react with things. It doesn't chemically bind. So argon is always trickling up from the depths of the earth where potassium decayed into argon. It trickles up, and when it trickles up from below, it comes into a rock, and it can stick in that rock because it travels through cracks. If it comes to an area where there's fewer cracks, it will accumulate there. When the scientists then test that rock for age, they'll find too much argon in it. And the excess argon problem is well known. If you do a computer search for that on the web, without endorsing anything, I used a Google search last night and found 54 million hits for excess argon. I've looked through those enough to know that about 30% of those are from scientific organizations reporting that they did radioactive age dating and they found excess argon. That's several million times they've done this. Another third of them, roughly, are from creation organizations saying, this means that you can't trust radioactive dating. And the other third are from anti-creation organizations who say that we don't know what we're talking about. I submit that there are enough scientists here and there are enough engineers working in this field, and just simple common sense will tell you that if you've got a problem that big, with argon coming from 4,000 miles deep and coming up into these rocks, it's going to give you more argon than what's there just from decay within that thin section of rock. On the rubidium and strontium, both of those are also water soluble. So some of the rubidium is being taken out of the rock, and some is being brought into the rock. While that's happening, some strontium is being taken out of the rock, and some strontium is being brought into the rock. So if you use rubidium-strontium aging on this, you don't actually know how much of that rubidium or strontium were part of the rock originally. All of the assumptions can be shown to be simply false. For the case where they're using uranium decaying into lead to get that dating. Well, I live in West Richland, Washington. Every year I get a report on the water quality of the city water supply. And it includes, near the end, alpha emitters. What's that? That's primarily uranium that's in our city water supply. And it gets through the filters and is delivered to us and we drink it. I work at a nuclear plant and nuclear safety, so I deal with radioactive isotopes all the time. But if I go into certain of our facilities, if I am suspected of getting some contamination, they'll take some biological samples and see how much uranium or plutonium I may have inside my body. They always ask whether we are from West Richland or not, because West Richland has more uranium in its water supply than any of the other local cities.
We better have a little bit of a disclaimer here. You're going to scare our audience. How much of this is getting out in the water supply?
Well, in the case of West Richland, the reason it's so high is because we get most of our water from groundwater, which flows through the ground, through the rocks, and trickles in and ends up in our wells. And most cities in this country have far less uranium in the water than West Richland does. But even West Richland, it's well below any guidelines that have been established by the Environmental Protection Agency. Those of you who trust government, that should reassure you. Those who don't, well, let me reassure you, for whatever my reassurance may be worth. It's such a small amount that nobody needs to worry about it. If a person moves from somewhere near sea level up to the high mountains, say Denver, you will just about double the amount of radiation you're getting because there's less atmosphere protecting you from radiation coming from the sun and from the stars. That is far bigger effect than the amount of uranium that I happen to be drinking.
Now I feel better.
Glad to reassure you and glad to reassure the audience.
I was afraid to drink water while I was here at Tri-Cities.
You might be afraid of it for other reasons. It's not the best tasting water around. Anyway, since the uranium does get dissolved from rocks that are up nearer the mountains than us, it's dissolved there, gets into the water, comes to us. Well, that means that the little rocks up there that it's flowing past and flowing through the cracks in the rocks, it's dissolving uranium out of those. Well, with less uranium in those rocks than what was there originally, if you do radioactive age dating based on uranium and lead, you find very little uranium and a lot of lead, so it appears to be very old, much older than it should be, much older than it actually is. Whatever radioactive decay method they use, whether it's potassium argon or strontium and rubidium or uranium and lead, there is no good reason to believe that radioactive age dating provides an absolute date, as many scientists claim that it does. And as I said, 54 million hits for excess argon. There are a similar number of hits for excess lead, for excess strontium, and, by the way, for too little lead and too little strontium, and for too little argon. Much too little argon because argon is trickling up from deep underground. But the scientists know about these issues, and yet they don't mention the general public. And apparently, Bill Nye is not aware of them. I do not believe that he intentionally misled anybody. Bill, hopefully you will see this. I don't believe you intentionally misled anybody. But some of your facts were simply not correct, and we're trying to point that out here.
That was really fascinating to me because I've been reading from the books, but now I talk to someone who actually works with radioisotopes, and you've done a tremendous amount of research, and you've just laid it out on the line very beautiful for us.
I just got my 35-year pin for working as a nuclear safety engineer, and from the first measurements that I did while I was still in high school until now, there are so many problems in laboratories, so many problems with the assumptions, so many problems that you really can't trust this stuff for anything beyond perhaps 20 years, and often not even for that short a period of time. To trust it for something that says that we're billions of years old, that's trusting man's opinion when the men are not admitting their own fallibility.
And you may wonder why, if radioisotope dating is so inaccurate, known to be inaccurate, known to be based on historical science, assumptions, beliefs, and not on real observational science, why do we keep hearing that we know the age of the Earth by radioisotope dating? Well, the answer is very simple. The evolutionists don't have anything else. They haven't got anything better. So this is one that's beyond the understanding of most of the general public, and it allows them to push political correctness. You see, we have the really two things that are used to age the Earth to billions of years. The other one is a geologic column. It was put together by a lawyer, amateur geologist, clear back in the early 1800s. And nowhere on Earth do we see it in proper order and complete except in textbooks and charts. In fact, there are over 500 different areas in the Earth, major areas, where the so-called older layers of the Earth are above the so-called younger layers. So the geologic column really is simply the result of the global flood. Now, with what little time we got left, Mark, I'd like to let you take a little moment of giving us some Bible.
I got a couple of things to say about what happened there at this debate. I watched this debate several times, trying to ingest everything that was said. And first of all, I just want to say that this TV program has a website, creationfoundations.org, and I manage that site. And at the very bottom down there, I put a link that says Bill Nye Ken Ham Debate. And it has every answer to Bill Nye, everything that he brought up in that debate. I've got 2 videos on there from CMI, Creation Ministries International. And then those videos lead you to different links. And so you can get every answer that Bill Nye gave. And you can also read more about what Ken Ham was trying to say, which he never really had much time to refute everything that Bill Nye said in his 30-minute presentation, because he brought up so many things, and then he never really covered them all that well. Now, we're not here to be critical of Bill Nye or anybody else, but we just would like to, set the record straight on a lot of things that he said. And when I was watching that debate, I was wondering, how can anybody say all the things that Bill Nye said and be so incorrect about those things? And if Ken Ham had been so incorrect about the things he had said, it'd be all over the news, And how is it that the world can teach this garbage about global warming and then not humble themselves enough to admit as to why now they're calling it climate change? And how is it that in the beginning, in the very early 1970s, they were worried about that the world was going through a cooling trend, and then they flip-flopped over to global warming, and then they went to climate change, and never really just fessing up, admitting that, hey, we're wrong, and we have ulterior motives as to why we're trying to convince people of global warming and convince people of evolution, which evolution is the foundation for this global warming, that animals take precedence over human beings, and I wondered about that, and you wonder, why is civilization in a self-destructive mode where now all we can ever talk about is legalizing abortion and same-sex marriage and all this terrible stuff, and teach evolution in school, this stuff that has been disproven in the textbooks time and time again? Well, there's an answer for this. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 28, it says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge." When you have a human civilization that will not retain God in their knowledge, there is no reason then to be honest about things anymore and to humble yourself and to say, oh, you know what, I think our research on these different matters of evolution is wrong, and we may as well just admit to it and just admit that global warming is not really there. You know, and so when you don't retain God in your knowledge, you automatically then become dishonest. Because you see, just like in the scientific world, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, in the spiritual world abhors a spiritual vacuum. Because either you are going to go the way of Christ, or you're going to go the way of the devil and the world and the flesh. There is no in between. You're going to go one way or the other. And I feel that that's what we saw represented in this debate here, because I actually, if we had time here, it's going to have to be the next show, but I was going to bring up several things where Bill Nye, where he did not study before he gave this debate. He didn't do his research. I mean, I thought it was kind of funny when he said that Yellowstone was in Idaho. It's not in Idaho, it's in Wyoming. There's a little sliver of it that's in Idaho, and this is something that I study about a lot, and I teach on volcanism and supervolcanoes. And so when I heard Bill Nye say that, boy, my ears went up, and I thought, you know, if Ken Ham would have been wrong like that, oh, they would have crucified him on the TV and radio and in articles and stuff. And so what this really comes down to is a worldview. It's like what Ken Ham was saying. Really, what this really comes down to is a worldview, and it's all based on your foundation. If you are retaining God in your mind, and if you're not, then you're going over here to the other side, to the evil side. And again, like I said, I'm not just trying to be critical of Bill Nye or anybody else, but this is the truth, okay? And so I want to finish this verse. It says, Romans 1:28, it says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient." And so having said that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dick.
Well, thanks. I think we've covered a lot of pretty important material here. One thing we notice about Ken Ham's presentation, which Mark just brought up, is that he was very conservative in his approach. And I think probably he stuck right to his script and was very careful not to say anything condemning at any time. In fact, he was a perfect Christian gentleman in this case. It was pretty awesome. He did pass up some really good chances to reply to some things that were pretty far out from correct. But he had in mind what Mark just brought up. If he had made any comment that was derogatory, if he had made any false statement concerning science, it would be all over the news media. He did not. It was a fantastic presentation in that there was nothing he said that could not be proven with actual evidence. And he said a lot. Well, folks, if you want more information on the creation evolution situation, go to our website, creationfoundations.org. Mark has put a terrific amount of work into it. There's lots of links on this website. There are lots of information that doesn't come over our television programs that he's put on there. So I'd recommend creationfoundations.org. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
The Bible talks about a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Well, there really was a worldwide flood. Just look at the